welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm really thrilled to introduce this event and our speakers. So we're putting on this event tonight. This is a collaboration between IPK and a group called Plastic Work, which is from by Kate, Spencer, and myself. So the goal of our group is to situate ongoing conversations about our changing labor landscape in the context of the history of labor. And one of the things that we really try to do in this group is to challenge a kind of stereotype or static vision of labor's past. And so I think that this could be a more perfect way to upend everything we thought we knew about unions in the 1950s as bureaucratic and conservative and conformist, and instead to see them as unruly, dynamic, and engines of incredible growth for marginal service workers. So I'm thrilled to introduce this author, Ryan Patrick Murphy, and Ryan is an associate professor of history at Earlham College. He's a historian of gender and sexuality, labor history, and urban history. His first book, Deregulating Desire, Flight Attendant Activism, Family Politics, and Workplace Justice, won the 2017 David Montgomery Award for Best Book in Labor History from the Organization for American Historians. And commenting today, we have Ruth Milkman, who is a distinguished professor of sociology at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies and the CUNY Graduate Center. She's the author of numerous books and articles on topics of labor history, from women in the auto industry during World War II to low-wage immigrant workers of the 20th and 21st centuries. Her most recent book is Immigrant Labor and the New Proletariat, which came out with Columbia Press in 2021. And we also have Patrick Egan, who is a political scientist who studies Americans' political attitudes, behaviors, and identities. He is the professor of NYU's Wilf Family Department of Politics and also has appointments in the Wagner School and the Wagner School's Department of Public Policy. And he is the author of Partisan Priorities, How Issue Ownership Drives and Distorts American Politics, which is a University Press. So with that, I'll turn it over to the speakers. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. I want to thank IPK for bringing me out here today. It's been wonderful to have a nice day in New York, and especially to thank Patrick and Ruth for commenting on my work. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a little, I'll read to you a little bit. So because I'm like, if we're going to talk about the book, why not do a little reading? And so I'm going to give you one little snippet so you can understand the organizing model that I'm talking about, which is the Teamsters mass organizing campaign in the service industry in the second half of the 1950s. And then I'm going to take you, and this is going to be in New York, so I did a New York, selected a New York vignette. We actually won't even call it New York, it's in the far-flung community of Levittown. And then we are going to, we will bring it to Detroit and talk about, so the first thing I'm going to read is going to try to think through what were the Teamsters doing to mobilize in the service sector in the public? And then I'm going to think about what is the inspiration of that as it functions inside of a single apartment in downtown Detroit in the summer of 1963. So here we go, and I will just read you for about 20 minutes and then we will talk. Okay. Salvatore Caruso's troubles began in the summer of 1958 with a brand new Wurlitzer jukebox. A slick new package for the year's hit songs, from the Everly Brothers, All I Have to Do Is Dream, the Silhouettes Get a Job, and the Coasters Yakety Yak. Caruso hoped the machine would encourage people to linger over martinis and Manhattans in the lounge of his Levittown, New York restaurant. Caruso had been a successful small businessman before the arrival of the Wurlitzer. He chose an ideal location, nestled amid middle-class families, newly built Cape Cod homes, and with the intersections of bustling Wantagh Parkway and Hempstead Turnpike providing ample automobile traffic. To capture the attention of passing motorists, Caruso built a tall, bold marquee featuring an image of himself tossing a pizza crust in turquoise and tomato-colored neon. The marquee became the center of the restaurant's branding, emblazoned on the glossy black matchbooks that Caruso bought from the Maryland Match Company in Baltimore. Even his choice to name the restaurant after himself was shrewd, as Caruso's surname would remind the local population, still adjusting to life in the suburbs, of the cuisine they left behind in the old immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Queens. thin crust pizza, ragu with tagliatelle, and panino napolitano stuffed with mozzarella. The Wurlitzer, however, was a mistake. To make space for the jukebox and for the smoke shop cigarette machine he also bought, Caruso broke the contract for his old jukebox with the New Wave Vending Company, which operated pinball machines, shuffleboard alleys, billiard tables, and other coin-operated equipment in 25 bars and restaurants around the Long Island suburbs. New Wave's owner, Herbert Jacob, did not take the news well, as he worried that Caruso's move would encourage other small business owners to follow suit, buying their own machines and avoiding sharing proceeds of customers' entertainment with service companies. On September 12, 1958, Jacob drove from his home in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, to pay Caruso a visit. He began by offering to purchase the Wurlitzer and the smoke shop in cash. When Caruso refused, Jacob threatened him, saying that Caruso could, quote, get hurt if he failed to honor the service contract with New Wave. Jacob also threatened Hal Zimmerman, the man who sold Caruso the jukebox, calling him on the phone and telling him, quote, you can't sell your machines to Caruso. You have a nice wife and child. You better get smart. Unfazed by the intimidation, Caruso continued to entertain customers with the Wurlitzer. Jacob then further escalated the situation, calling Teamsters Local 266, a union that regularly did business with New Wave. Teamsters leaders agreed to help and notified Sylvia Goldberg of the trouble in Levittown. Goldberg managed the logistics of mobilizing the union's most powerful tool, the picket line. 12 days after Jacob's visit, a man appeared under the restaurant's marquee, holding a sign that warned customers that Salvatore Caruso was unfair to labor. In a neighborhood home to many Eastern and Southern European Catholic and Jewish residents, many of whom had been active during the labor struggles of the 1930s New York in their youth, crossing a picket line was a shameful act. Caruso quickly recognized that absent a deal with Jacob and the Teamsters, his long loyal customers would vanish. This part of my book explores the small Catholic and Jewish family businesses like Salvatore Caruso's and Herbert Jacob's, those that were the economic foundation of what I call the Teamsters Metropolis. New York City's coin-operated vending machine business is the primary focus of this part of my work, though I also point to similar dynamics in commercial laundering, uniform supply services, electrical and plumbing manufacturing, office equipment, and I won't finish reading all of the quotes. Prominent historians, from Nelson Lichtenstein to Robert Self to Kim Phillips Fine, have framed mid-20th century societies as structured by bureaucratic institutions, those that define a Walter Reuther-style corporatist capitalism. The agencies of the federal government, large corporations, and the industrial unions that grew out of the CIO movement of the 1930s. In both scholarly accounts and in a spectrum of critiques, from John Kenneth Galbraith's The Affluent Society, to Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, to Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, the suburban cul-de-sac, General Motors, and the United Automobile Workers signify the dominant, heteronormative, and often racially segregated mass culture of the Cold War era. Salvatore Caruso, Herbert Jacob, and Sylvia Goldberg rejected that homogenized world, refusing to embrace the restrained personal demeanor, the controlled bodily comportment, and the respect for authority that were defining features of the middle class of the 1950s. Rather than contain themselves on the cul-de-sac, Caruso, Jacob, and Goldberg lived metropolitan lives, mixing home and work both in the new suburbs and in the older central city neighborhoods of their parents and grandparents. Rather than rely on the large corporation for a wage, they worked for themselves and continued to foster the small businesses their families had built decades earlier. And rather than join large, amalgamated locals of steel workers, the mine workers, the auto workers, and other CIO industrial unions, they built small AFL craft unions, many of which would end up affiliating with the Teamsters by the end of the 50s. I argue that these small businesses and Teamster locals were the primary venue for the cultural struggle over the meaning of suburbanization and the attendant investment in whiteness and heterosexuality for the children and grandchildren of Jewish and Catholic new immigrant families like Caruso's, Jacob's, and Goldberg's. Jimmy Hoffa understood this, which is why he made the service sector a crux of his rise to power in the Teamsters. I thus frame the International Brotherhood of Teamsters as a mechanism for Eastern and Southern European Catholics and Jews to struggle over where they would fit into the city, how they would be white, and if they would be normal sexual subjects. While other parts of my work analyze how Black and Latino activists built their own political structures in the Teamsters Metropolis, this part of my work examines the specific cultural unrest among a particular cohort of Jews and Catholics whose whiteness, as May Nye has so sharply demonstrated in Impossible Subjects, had been stabilized by the immigration, housing, and labor policy reforms of the 20s and 30s. The bars and restaurants such as Caruso's in Levittown, where this cohort socialized, were deeply contradictory spaces. Those where Catholic and Jewish people could cavort, where libidos rose as jukeboxes played music from Black artists to white audiences, where people refused to cross picket lines when the Teamsters warned of trouble, and where people took full advantage of the segregated world that the Federal Housing Administration, labor policy, the police, and their own physical violence created. That unruliness, that which Jimmy Hoffa so shrewdly harnessed, is the subject of my work. Okay, so that's the big picture, like, out in the world. Like a picket line appearing in front of a restaurant, threatening someone to get them to keep, working with your small business. But like, I think the question is, what actually makes people organize, right? It's a pain in the ass to like, go out there and hold a picket sign, or to like, threaten someone, right? You're threatening your own freedom if you get caught and get sent to jail. So like, why do you do it? So I'm gonna take us now inside the apartment of one person. And that person is Sylvia Pagano, who is a sort of unknown historical figure who is the connect between Jimmy Hoffa and the underworld in Detroit in the 1940s. And together, Sylvia Pagano and Hoffa are the people that helped reverse the underworld under Santo Peroni in Detroit from being a militant, violent anti-union organization to one that was just fine with unions. And I would argue that that move was the reason that the Teamsters flourished and other unions flourished, is to get the underworld to back off. It's not a story about Santo Peroni, only it's a story about Jimmy Hoffa's friend Sylvia Pagano. Here's her life inside of her apartment. And you might ask, how do I know this? But I'm just gonna read and then we can figure that out in the Q&A. Sylvia Pagano's access to the public world of men was the result of a relationship to the private sphere. By the early 1960s, apartment 606C, so this is in downtown Detroit, had become a venue for what historian Nyan Shah calls queer domesticity. Through his study of people who immigrated from East and South Asia to the US West Coast in the early 20th century, Shah shows that marginal workplace people far outside the border of the nuclear family, living oceans away from their parents, spouses, and children, cohabitating with other workers rather than with blood relatives, finding sex through homosexual and commercial encounters rather than in long-term monogamous heterosexual relationships. While accounting for the pain of the broken bonds that comes with global migration, I think Shah's work is particularly compelling because it also theorizes the new life worlds that people build in their unconventional homes, places where they pool financial resources, build political movements, and share friendship and intimacy in a way that makes an exploitative world more survivable and more joyful. Shah writes about a particular context, how anti-Asian racism, immigration policy, and labor law systematically denied non-white immigrants the privileges that had made Sylvia Pagano, her friend Anthony Giacalone, and Jimmy Hoffa into middle-class American white people by the 1950s. But despite the vastly different historical milieu, Shah's insights help explain why Sylvia Pagano achieved the stature that she did. Pagano, Hoffa, and their friends came of age in Depression-era U.S. industrial cities, those largely made up of migrant workers from Appalachia, from the Jim Crow South, and from Eastern and Southern Europe. Out of necessity, and Pagano's coming of age demonstrates, most of those workers formed friendships, intimacies, and households that flouted the norms of the conventional nuclear family. By the time Pagano was providing investment consultations to the Teamsters in the 60s, however, the Depression-era urban paradigm had given way to a middle-class suburban one. Shaw compels us to consider that rather than uncritically adopting suburban cultural norms and abandoning the queer domesticity that was a defining feature of the immigrant industrial city of the 30s, Pagano and her friends adopted some of the unconventional family structures that had defined the world of their youth. In these porous, flexible kinship networks, Pagano found social mobility and gained access to money, power, autonomy, and pleasure typically reserved for men. The queer domesticity of apartment 606C was particularly evident during the turbulent summer of 1963. These were probably the busiest months of Jimmy Hoffa's career, as he was making the final push to compel trucking companies to sign the National Master Freight Agreement, a watershed deal that standardized wages for long-distance truckers across the entire industry. Since the middle of the 1950s, long-haul truckers had been paid even better than their peers in other heavily unionized industries, earning 11% more than miners, 8% more than manufacturing workers, and 1.5% more than meatpackers. This deal would lock in that advantage and augment it with an additional pay bump plus a mandatory employer contribution of 10.3% of an employee's wage to the Teamsters welfare and pension funds. This nationwide deal represented an apex of trade union power in the United States, and it delivered a solidly middle-class lifestyle to the people who grew up in poverty and who were never able to access formal education. Hammering out that agreement took virtually all of Jimmy Hoffa's time, and much of the time of his wife, Josephine Hoffa, and of Sylvia Pagano. The two of them traveled to 29 states promoting the contract in 1963 alone. Just right there, like Hoffa's wife is a key backer of this deal. While that push was hopeful and invigorating, it also took a toll on Jimmy Hoffa's personal life, as he was virtually never home. Meanwhile, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy's dragnet was closing in on Hoffa, relentlessly surveilling, cataloging, and appraising every aspect of his public and private life in an unceasing effort to purge him from the Teamsters Union and send him to jail, which finally happened in 1967. Those two details, Jimmy Hoffa's absence during the freight agreement push and the constant threat of imprisonment, were debilitating to Josephine Hoffa. August 14, 1963. Pagano is on the phone with Josephine Hoffa. Hoffa is sobbing, and Pagano can be heard trying to comfort her to no avail on multiple phone calls throughout the day. Sometime in the previous days, and during a period of extreme drinking, Josephine Hoffa had begun to suffer a mental health break. Something just snapped inside her head, Pagano can be heard telling her daughter-in-law, Marianne O'Brien, and now you can start to understand that Sylvia Pagano had an FBI microphone in her living room. Pagano went on to describe how Josephine Hoffa was strapped to a bed in a hospital, spending most of the day and night heavily sedated. It's also really disturbing to see a mental health crisis happen in 1963, especially to a woman. Pagano seems to have been the primary point person for this family emergency and can be heard talking to Jimmy Hoffa, who was on the road working for the freight deal, to communicate what was happening and strategize about the response. Jimmy Hoffa was clearly shaken, and he ordered Pagano to keep either herself, Sylvia's son Chuck O'Brien, next to Jimmy Hoffa to Josephine Hoffa at all times, and to hide this information from strangers from the press. Pagano coordinated the news of crisis to the inner circle of Teamster and underworld leaders. During that same phone call, Pagano tells Marianne O'Brien, her daughter-in-law, that Bill Buffalino, a higher-up in the Detroit underworld, was also down at the hospital with Josephine. During this intense period, when she was trying to protect Josephine Hoffa's privacy and her health, Sylvia Pagano faced a second dilemma in the Hoffa family, and I think this really exemplifies what it was like to be a working woman in the 60s, where not only are you running giant financial deals between the underworld and the Teamsters, but you're dealing with this. August 15th, 1963. The day after the painful phone calls to Josephine Hoffa's hospital room, Pagano has to break the news to Josephine Hoffa's mother, whom everyone refers to as Ma, that the family intended for her to move into a nursing home. Jimmy Hoffa and Pagano knew that the stairs inside Hoffa's small home on Robson Street in Detroit, where Ma had been living, were no longer safe for her. So it's interesting that Hoffa has probably $2 million in a safe in his room, but he lives in an 1,100 square foot home that is a tiny house with his mother-in-law all the way through his life till he disappears in the summer of 1975. Pagano can be heard on the microphone raving about how luxurious the home was, enthusiastically describing the laundry service that Ma would receive, and reminding Ma that she would have her own private suite. Pagano's efflorescence clearly did nothing to sell Ma on the move to the home. August 21st, 6 days later, Pagano has to call Jimmy Hoffa to tell him that Ma, quote, flew the coop, somehow temporarily disappearing from the Hoffa's house in an apparent protest against the move to the nursing home. On the telephone, Hoffa can be heard exasperated, angry, and distressed that what he sees is his mother-in-law's self-involved stunt in the middle of the wider struggle with Josephine Hoffa's mental health. Later that day, Pagano notifies her son, Chuck O'Brien, that she's not even telling Josephine Hoffa about any of this, given the fragility of her state. A decision that clearly placed even more burden on Pagano because it forced her to manage the crisis alone while Hoffa was on the road. So just amazing to hear her dealing with a nursing home and then being like, okay, we are going to do this deal to build this hotel in Florida and my cut is 20%. It's all going to be in cash and it's coming in a bag on Tuesday afternoon. Back to the program. While she provided care for the Hoffas and their children, the queer domesticity of apartment 606C also involved romance and sex. While the nature of those connections varied over time, all of those intimacies took place far beyond the boundary of the traditional nuclear family. During the period that the FBI microphone recorded, Pagano was having a relationship with her primary business partner, Anthony Giacalone, a man her son Chucky called Uncle Tony. And for the period before her mental health crisis worsened in the summer and fall of 1963, Josephine Hoffa was also having an intimate relationship with Anthony Samini, a member of the Detroit underworld who co-owned at least one business with Giacalone and Pagano. July 26, 1963. It's 1:30 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. Sylvia Pagano, Josephine Hoffa, Anthony Samini, and Anthony Giacalone are all in Pagano's living room, listening to records and having afternoon cocktails. In passing, they note that Pagano had quote-unquote been going with Giacalone for 6 years, and that Samini and Josephine Hoffa had been together for a year. This afternoon gathering was typical for the way that Pagano entertained in her home. While she certainly hosted dinners and often invited guests for the typical 1950s 5 o'clock cocktail party, Pagano's favorite social event was the long Sicilian lunch. On dozens of occasions, Pagano can be heard convening with Giacalone around 1 p.m., cooking as the two discuss the Teamsters and other business, and as Ruby and Marie, the domestic workers, punctuated the conversation with the vacuum. I just want you to think about that, and we can talk about the humor. Sometimes they would retire to the bedroom. On this particular day, the two couples spent the whole afternoon together, and it could be heard exchanging sweetly romantic goodbyes as both of the Tonys left Pagano's apartment around 5:30. While we cannot know exactly how Sylvia Pagano understood the linkage between business, friendship, and romantic love in her relationships, we do know that she sometimes spoke about them in candid terms. Words captured on the microphone in the living room of apartment 606C reveal, for example, that while she felt deeply connected to Anthony Giacalone, she did not imagine that their kinship would or should transition into a traditional monogamous marriage. April 17, 1963. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Pagano is on the phone with a friend whom FBI agents cannot identify. The friend asks Pagano if she's going to marry Giacalone. Getting married, Pagano interjects, seemingly exasperated. In this, she's now going to talk in Giacalone's voice, and I find it very hard not to go into character as Giacalone, or into sort of drag character as Pagano imitating. I kind of really wanted to hear what she sounded like. So here she is talking as Giacalone. She's talking to herself. She says, "Getting married?" Pagano interjects, seemingly exasperated. "Oh, are you kidding me? No." She then starts speaking to her friend in Giacalone's voice to explain where the relationship stands in her opinion. "Sylvia, remember, I've got a family. I have children, and I would never leave them. I will never leave them, and I know you wouldn't want me to leave them. You must find someone who can take care of you. And I don't just mean anybody, because you gotta have somebody." That's the way he talks to me. The tone of Pagano's words is simply frank. She does not seem irritated by what she portrays as Giacalone's conventionally patriarchal assumption that she needed a husband breadwinner, even though her daily life obviously proved otherwise. We hear her on the transcript right before this pick up a bag with $100,000 in cash in it, so didn't necessarily need someone to say that. But nor does she seem to pine for him, or to express a wish or a hope that Giacalone would eventually play that role. It seems that both Pagano and Giacalone probably assumed that she would, most likely, marry someone else someday. Sylvia Pagano's matter-of-fact way of talking about her relationship with Giacalone is consistent with her tough, business-like tone in most of the conversations that the FBI microphone captured in Apartment 606C. In a few instances, however, Pagano showed great vulnerability as she described the unconventional life that she lived. August 15, 1963, 11:30 a.m. Pagano was on the phone with Josephine Hoffa the day after she checked into the hospital. She speaks what are some of the most introspective, most painful words in the transcript. "Are you listening to me? Because I love you, Josephine. I don't want anything to happen to you. You are all I got. I haven't got anybody. Sure, I got my mother. Same. She can take care of herself and everything. That's all I got. I got nobody else." At first glance, the loneliness in these words is baffling in the wider context of Pagano's dealings. Sylvia Pagano lived a strikingly full life, full of friends, dynamic businesses, social mobility, and money. But in this moment of self-doubt, a shrewd businesswoman writes off all of her assets. She writes off Jimmy Hoffa, Anthony Giacalone, and all of her businesses, writes off her luxury apartment. She writes off the Teamsters, and she writes off La Cosa Nostra. Her only love, the only one she can count on, is Josephine Hoffa. After 3 decades of queer scholarship and activism that has transformed the way we think about the past, we must consider all possible meanings of the words, "Because I love you, Josephine, you are all I got," even though we have little concrete evidence to interpret what Pagano meant here. While romantic love could certainly be evident in these words, I argue that a different queer formation is coming into view. In a pain moment, Sylvia Pagano acknowledged that she lived far outside the box that society had made for her in the 1950s and 1960s, and that living outside the box was a lonely place to be. Yes, she spoke to Jimmy Hoffa constantly about interesting, substantive events. Yes, she could get Anthony Provenzano or any other underworld higher-up on the phone in minutes, and we heard her doing that all the time. Yes, she could buy a brand new 4-barrel Pontiac V8 in cash and drive it as fast as she wanted. Yes, many people told vivid stories about the many handsome men for whom Sylvia Pagano was an object of desire. But here, in a moment of doubt, Pagano knew that she owned none of these things. She knew full well that there was no place for a single woman in the mid-20th century to run a business, to lead the labor movement, or to challenge the culture of the American family on her own terms. At least in this moment, Pagano knew that as an atypical person, everything she built could vanish. A friendship was all that Sylvia Pagano had, which during a moment of crisis was little solace in a society that values blood kinship, marriage, monogamy, and domesticity over the more ambiguous concept of friendship as a defining feature of a relationship you can count on. Pressing, though Pagano's dilemmas most certainly were, there is little historical evidence with which to process them. A year after this paying telephone conversation, and presumably because the trajectory of its case against La Cosa Nostra changed, the FBI removed the microphone from Apartment 606C and stopped surveilling Pagano. Amid growing public awareness of the backlash against the FBI's counterintelligence campaign against the civil rights movement, the Justice Department strove to hide the illegal wiretaps it had authorized in the 1960s, which delayed the dissemination of information about Pagano's surveillance. And just for anyone who thinks that Trump violating court orders is new, Bobby Kennedy took this search to the Supreme Court, lost, and did it anyway. So keep that in mind. Meanwhile, Jimmy Hoffa went to prison in 1967 after being convicted of jury tampering. Losing her direct line to the general president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters undoubtedly undermined Pagano's professional stature and weakened her financial position. 3 years later, while Hoffa continued to serve his sentence in the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, Sylvia Pagano's story ended abruptly. During a business trip for the Teamsters to New York on December 17, 1970, she suffered a heart attack. At 56 years old, Sylvia Pagano died. Her son, Chuck O'Brien, spoke of his debilitating depression that followed her death, and of the scores of Teamsters who lined up to attend her funeral. Yet, until the new wave of scrutiny that followed Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance in July of 1975, the woman who helped shape the Teamsters' financial and political strategy during the peak of the union's political and economic power remained absent in the widespread coverage of those victories. We can talk more about that later, but I'm going to stop and let my wonderful respondents respond.
I wanted to thank Maya for inviting me to be a commentator. It's great to meet Ryan. I really love reading this old original book. Can you hear me okay?
No.
Loud. Okay, I'll try to talk up. I usually have a really loud voice. Okay. So this book contributes to an emerging stream of research on the AFL as opposed to CIO unions from people like Dorothy Sue Cobble, Christopher Tomlins, Howard Kimmeldorf, me, and others who have resurrected the once scorned AFL unions and argued that there is a lot to learn from the history of those unions, Teamsters among them, in the pre-New Deal era. And this is not just the story of union corruption, the familiar one that we all know, tied to not only the Teamsters but other former AFL affiliates. You may know that the Hotel Workers Union, for example, was legendarily corrupt, as was the SEIU, another AFL union of that time. This is also the history of service sector organizing, a sector that has, of course, mushroomed dramatically in more recent decades, and which can rarely be outsourced, which is we all are aware of, including businesses like gay bars, gay bathhouses, pornographic theaters, and so on. This book exposes the enduring potential of AFL, former AFL affiliates strategies, organizing strategies like taking wages out of competition for the labor people in the room. That just means lifting wage standards by organizing enough of the businesses in a given sector that they don't have to compete on the basis of wages and therefore can all pay a decent wage. Winning portable benefits, including pensions, which you didn't talk about that much today, but that's a very important theme in the book. The organizing that these kinds of unions did then and still do in some cases is often maligned or, criticized as, quote, top down. As in the story, the New York story that Brian read at the beginning, pressuring employers directly to win union recognition is a standard will in this, that's not the right metaphor, a standard part of their arsenal. And also, again, you didn't really speak about this, but it's in the book, the advantages of decentralized organizational forms that the AFL was characterized by, as opposed to CIO unions, which tend to be much more centralized. And aggressive tactics like the picket line you described, secondary boycotts. This is a little inside baseball for those of you who know what those are, and recognition strikes, and just plain old muscle, which we saw your example of. So even though, the excerpt Brian started with is about New York, the book is mostly about Detroit. And Detroit, of course, is famous and best known to labor historians for the UAW, but Ryan highlights it as the home of Jimmy Hoffa. A student of mine pointed out that if you go to the airport in Detroit, there's like this big image of Jimmy Hoffa greeting you. Like they're very proud of their that legacy. And also to extensive Teamster service sector organizing in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, mostly outside the Wagner Act. And this and the form it takes is very different from, I don't know, a number of you maybe know this old book by Brian Palmer called Revolutionary Teamsters, which is about the 1934 Minneapolis strike, which was led by Trotskyists. And so that's like one image that people have of the Teamsters, but this is really different, organizing, small businesses basically, in this very different way. And it's extremely successful. They build up a huge membership, not just in trucking, but in this other service sector stuff. But then, of course, comes the backlash. So Murphy mines the 37-month McClellan Commission hearings that were held in the late 1950s well, you already shared some of this, but which revealed that RFK Sr. was not as progressive as we often think. Has more in common with his son than you might,
yes.
than you might assume. And he tracks the delegitimation of the Teamsters and its role in the wider phenomenon of union decline, which starts exactly then. You may know that the peak in union density is 1955. Of course, there are many other factors contributing to that decline too. And actually, the steepest decline in Teamster membership comes quite a bit later, after trucking is deregulated in 1980, and with the wider corporate assault on unions that we all know about in the late 70s and early 80s. Membership of the Teamsters peaks at 2.2 million in 1974. I think you have that number in there somewhere. I looked it up too. By 1987, it's only 1 million. Today, it's a little more than that. But trucking is not the whole story, and indeed, the book's original contribution, in my view, is its concept. Somehow this phrase didn't occur in your talk today, in the excerpts you read, but it occurs throughout the book, of what he calls unruly unionism, in which labor organizing itself is a countercultural form of anti-work politics that expands the access of ordinary workers, queer or straight, to life's pleasures, including conspicuous consumption in its rich, kitsch, vulgar form. Think gold chains, furs, Miami, and later Vegas, although you don't talk about Vegas, I think it's a similar story. Vacation. By the way, Brian mentions that many of the Miami hotels of the day were built with money from Teamster pension. So Murphy, Ryan, I should call him, since he's right here, emphasizes the McClellan hearing's focus on the flamboyant vulgarity, the speech, the clothing, and desires of Teamster cadre as a way of shaming organized labor from the Robert Kennedy family perspective. These are vulgar people. Alongside the well-known focus of those hearings on corruption, paving the way to neoliberal deregulation and anti-union assault of the 1970s. So far, so good. And what I just described is pretty much the focus of the first half or so of the book, which you should read for yourselves. There's no time to get into this, but there is a chapter on race, and Ryan did talk a little bit about whiteness and the fact that the Jewish and Italian immigrants that had moved to the suburbs in this period were central to this whole story. There's also some discussion of the ways in which later, when black and immigrant workers, the newer immigrant workers, do become part of the Teamsters, how that all played out. One thing I was skeptical about in the book is in that chapter, the kind of top-down focus on organizing bosses that led to the Teamsters' earlier success, which you sort of see in very positive terms in the first half of the book, is now demonized as collusive and disempowering of black workers. And if that is the case, why was it different from the earlier period? Like, were there similar forms of exploitation by the union itself vis-a-vis the earlier generations of service sector workers? Maybe not, but certainly paper locals existed there too. Why did these earlier episodes of this kind of organizing lead to major improvements in pay and benefits, pensions, all the rest, and not in the later periods? Is it just racism or what? I'd love to hear more about that. The chapter on Sylvia Pagano, part of which you just heard, the Teamsters, I never heard of her before, and I feel like I know a little bit about labor history of that period. This underappreciated female power broker, which does, as you saw, mine extensive FBI records, embraces this notion of queer culture or queer domesticity that includes heterosexual extramarital affairs. Apart from that very compelling example of what she said to Josephine Hoffa, it seems like the main way in which she's outside of conventional domesticity is that she has these lovers who come to her apartment. I mean, you know, that who are men, and Josephine Hoffa does too. So I'm no expert on queer theory, but does queer domesticity include that stuff? I don't know. Maybe it does. Anyway, but these are relatively minor quibbles. I think this book is really important in that it casts a completely different perspective on the Teamsters and more broadly on the AFL unions of the first half of the 20th century. And I think it's a really important contribution that I hope you'll all read. I have 3 questions. Are we supposed to be asking him questions? I wasn't really clear, but I'm going to do it. So these are sort of not that central to your narrative, but I think they're really important questions. 1, what accounts for the overrepresentation of queers among labor movement activists past and present? It's something I've noticed, not only in this case, I mean, I know you don't really show that in the case of the Teamsters, so you sort of imply it. But it's true, for example, in the Starbucks Workers United campaign, as you may have noticed. Like, it's really striking. Yeah, and I think it's true historically, too, though we don't have good data on this, that it's a thing. And it's not only true of union organizing, but also of Black Lives Matter, as you may know, or the Dreamers, remember them? The immigrant kids who focus on the Dream Act. So that's one question. Can we understand that in some way through your lens? Another question I had is the sort of anti-work politics, the sort of pro-pleasure, unruly unionism you described, is that specific to the Teamsters or the AFL unions, or is that something all unions embrace? I don't know the answer, but I'd be very curious to hear your view. In principle, certainly the lifting up of living standards and allowing workers to afford, those kitsch luxuries is not specific to this type of movement. And then finally, what are the implications of this book for the labor movement's future, given that the service sector is the core of the economy nowadays, and this is service sector. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Ryan, thanks for the great book, and it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you here today. So I just want to preface this with I am not a historian, and I'm a political scientist, and I study political attitudes with numbers. I use a lot of survey data. I'm sitting in front of a computer with statistical analyses and all that good stuff. So I'm coming at this a little bit a lot outside of the field, but with a lot of appreciation for the kinds of contributions one can get from historical qualitative work, the great work that Ryan has produced, and a big believer in conversations among our fields and among our disciplines. Of this, I think this can be one. But I also will say that I'm approaching this with a lot of modesty, because I don't feel like I'm in a good place to appraise the book. Ruth very much more is. But I think what I hope I can do, and I think actually some of my reactions dovetail with some of your questions, Ruth, is give you a sense of the kinds of reactions and thoughts that inspired in me as somebody who studies contemporary politics with a big focus on political attitudes, particularly around the kinds of issues around sex and gender that Ryan touches on in the book, and it becomes a big part of his narrative. So my thoughts will kind of wander in those directions, and hopefully they'll be helpful. So Teamsters Metropolis describes a world where organized crime, often working hand in hand with hardscrabble labor organizers, financed and in some cases work to protect lesbian and gay establishments, including bars, nightclubs, and bathhouses, from government suppression in the 1950s and 1960s. One of those organizations still exists just a few blocks away from here. It is called Julius's. Always remember the apostrophe after the S. One of my favorite gay bars in New York, the site of a sip-in, not a sit-in, a sip-in that protested government surveillance and suppression of that place because it served gay customers in the 1960s. And as Ryan recounts in the book, that was financed and owned by folks perhaps close to organized crime, perhaps close to the Teamsters. All these things get a little murky, but it sounds like certainly that was one good example of an establishment that served mostly gay men and was financed and to some degree protected by the Teamsters and the organized crime. In fact, they financed a lawsuit that ended up putting a stop to a lot of the government and police suppression and raids of the bar in the late 1960s. So I was struck by a provocative passage from the very end of the book, and I'll just read it to you. I don't have a page number. I wish I did, or else we could follow along, but hopefully my narrative will be enough. So you write, Teamster activists built a countercultural movement and often took aim at the elite institutions that constituted the liberal, meritocratic values of the United States. That conflict was abundantly evident in the Teamsters Genovese allies' investment in gay public sexual space in the 1950s, of the kind I was just talking about, including the Everard Baths here in New York City. You write, while Ivy League sociology, psychology, and public health professors, the managers of large corporations, and policymakers in the mid-20th century bureaucracy all imagined the patrons of the Everard Baths to be degenerates who deserved no protections of citizenship, the infrastructure of the Teamsters Metropolis helped to finance, supply, and operate a place where queer people could live their lives. It has been a central argument of this book that the willingness to take that risk, to make the countercultural intervention that thwarted American Protestant culture while opening a space for people whom society had cast aside, drove the International Brotherhood of Teamsters' remarkable success. So that's a pretty provocative claim, right? That to kind of locate the Teamsters and kind of, certainly when we think about the gruff, rhetoric and self-presentation that often underlies labor unions, and we think of them as being countercultural, I think that's sort of a main theme that you're kind of addressing in the book. And again, when I think about that contrast to what we think about today, where I would say the Ivy League professoriate, large corporations, and government bureaucrats are all places where, all things being equal, there's a lot more tolerance for sexual and gender diversity than in working class contexts. I mean, I think it's safe to say that. It makes you wonder, is there a shift, or has always been the case that we had that the Teamsters were the exception to the rule in terms of working class people and organization supporting countercultural thrusts, or has something shifted where now professionals, and certainly highly educated professionals of the kind who sit in this room, are much more supportive of gender and sexual diversity than people who work in factories, who work in farms, who work at the hard-scrabble jobs that the labor movement is typically associated with. And if you don't believe me, I can tell you it's reflected in survey data. So there is this overwhelming class divide with regard to sexuality, gender, and gender roles. So for example, in 2024, about 1/3 of those without a college education said they believe that same-sex sex is, quote, always wrong. That's compared to just 1/4 of those with a college education. A strong majority, 78% of those with a college degree, disagree with the statement, it's better for men to work and for women to tend the home. A number that declines to just 61% among those without a degree. We see similar differences with regard to class on issues like transgender rights, premarital sex, abortion, and other controversies regarding sex and gender. So to adopt some of the language of my more humanities-focused colleagues, progressive attitudes about sex and gender are perhaps a bona fide marker of bourgeois status, whereas working class people, represented by unions, especially like the Teamsters today, from truck drivers to hotel housekeepers to prison guards, are much more likely to espouse traditional views on these kinds of issues. So with those facts on the table, and we can quibble at those facts, but I think most political scientists would say the class divide definitely would say progressive attitudes on sex and gender, not economics necessarily, but certainly on sex and gender, lean on this class divide toward people with more education, more resources, more privilege, is an important kind of finding that we see consistently in survey data. Anyway, that leads me to two questions. The first is, would a Teamster-like strategy of flouting bourgeois values be successful today? Has the whole notion of flouting bourgeois values been flipped on its head, in that traditional notions of sex and gender are now the anti-establishment attitudes, right? So for example, we see this a lot, we saw this a lot in coverage of the 2024 election. Union leaders consistently report that they're having difficulty keeping their members loyal to the Democratic Party as Trump and the MAGA movement ply their members away, often with socially conservative messages on things like transgender rights. So I think that's an interesting idea, and I think you also asked this a little bit, Ruth, which is, to what extent does what we learned from Ryan's book tell us about labor dynamics and attitudes around these kinds of issues today? And then relatedly, and I said this a minute ago, and this is going to be an imprecise question, but to what extent is this a new phenomenon? So that is it the case that middle-class professional life and values were once more conventional than those of working-class people, right? So you certainly get the sense if you go to, you read like Charles Dickens, right, where you compare the working-class values with bourgeois values in that kind of era, where the upper middle class is very, very focused on maintaining reputation, maintaining privilege, maintaining a story about how kind of buttoned up, literally, they are compared to folks that they look down on and who have less privilege, less resources, etc. Was this true in the 1950s and 1960s? And I think the story is really complicated. So I first think about, if anyone has seen the series Fellow Travelers, set in 1950s, 1960s DC, where all these closeted gay and lesbian people are trying to navigate the waters of McCarthyism. And also James Kirchick's recent book on gay DC in that era. And so this is a world where upper middle class queer people are kind of in a very conventional space, and in a sense may have less wiggle room to adopt these non-conventional values compared to working class people at the time. That's an argument I would definitely buy. I also think a little bit about John D'Amelio's work, where his argument is that the upheavals of capitalism in post-war America kind of release people from family ties as they migrate to places like San Francisco and New York City, and are able to flout convention because of this, and create what he calls sexual communities in these cities. And so that has something to do with class and economics and the change in the relationships between working class people and upper middle class people. And then finally, I'm thinking a little bit about what we know about organizing at this time. So for example, the Mattachine Society, which is a group of mostly middle-class white gay guys, largely out of Los Angeles, who have this funny mix. They come from a background in labor organizing, and some of them are bona fide pinko comedies, at the time. And as this history proceeds, they become more and more conventional, become more and more kind of enmeshed and committed to the idea that there's nothing different about gay people compared to straight people. We're just as good as you, etc. And that kind of message becomes kind of the liberal civil rights message adopted by the mainstream LGBT movement in the 80s, 90s, and perhaps even today. So I think it's just a complicated thing. I don't have a good answer. I think your book really gives us a lot of nice ideas about the answers to those questions. And that's what I loved about it, is that it really provoked me, as somebody who studies pretty much the present, to think about what the past tells us about the present, and it's particularly about the trajectory of this story with regard to professionals and working class people around these controversies regarding sex and gender. I'll leave it there, and just thanks again for the book.
What do you want to do? You tell me. I can. Do you want to involve the audience? Do you want to deal with their questions? What should we do?
Yeah. And then you can weave in.
Yeah, weave it in. Yeah.
Okay. I was always a union member. I started teaching in New York City at age 20 and ended at age 74. I actually had some sort of a minor administrative position in the union. So I'm very supportive of unions. I will also tell you that during one point in my life, I had a friend who was a Teamster. He rode the trucks. He was very grateful for Jimmy Hoffa. And he felt the union was very good and he got the most benefits that he could possibly get. So he had only positive things to say about Jimmy Hoffa. So I do not understand the following. Why was the FBI, also, I think everything in life, many facets of it are corrupt. Corruption is all over. Okay, so to say some people or some unions are more corrupt than others, I don't know. I think they all misplace monies, et cetera, just the way politicians do, just the way, even in your own home, the husband doesn't know what the wife is saving on the side, et cetera. That happens to be universal. Okay. Why was the FBI, you mentioned about a microphone,
Yeah.
they're being surveilled by the FBI. Why were they interested in investigating this union
Yeah.
with such government surveillance when it seems the workers were very happy with them? They were not suppressed.
I know.
They might lose.
Yes. Yes is the answer. But okay, so here's what happened, what I would say. So the 1954 midterms happen, and the Democrats take back the House, and I forget which House is flipped which year. But the McCarthy committee, Joseph McCarthy's committee, had been defamed because he, the PUAC thing, he was, it's just this terrible reign of terror. And so once the Democrats take over, they're like, what are we going to do with this investigative committee? And newly elected senator from Massachusetts is John F. Kennedy. And he's like, my brother is smart, 31 years old, and just graduated from Harvard. Let's give him a job. And so he gets a job for that committee as this chief legal staff person. And he's like, who are we going to investigate? Investigating communists, that was not good, right? So let's figure out, and so he starts just kind of going out for drinks with his friends. And he befriends Clark Mollenhoff, who is a writer for the Minneapolis Tribune, who says, Bobby, there's a conspiracy with the Teamsters Union. It's the biggest threat to the United States other than communism in the world. And young Bobby Kennedy is like, whoa, like that is, like I could build my career off of doing this. And so he and the Kennedys and then their liberal allies build a machine that appeals to both the left and the right. A sort of emerging left idea that's sort of liberal, that like that these corrupt top-down unions aren't good, and then an emerging right-wing idea that, we can push the labor movement back with this, and so he just finds a way to run with it, and it's a great way to understand the critique of the bureaucracy of the mid-20th century. It was kind of self-sustaining, and after 6 months, he has 125 staff people that are going out there and looking at everything in every Teamsters local, interviewing everybody. They end up calling 1,500 witnesses. And you're exactly right. If you had staff people looking at my life and interviewed 100 witnesses to talk about it, I would be in trouble, right? And so that, yes. Yes.
All right, another aspect.
Wait,
Go on, let her do it.
Yeah.
No, let her continue.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. When you spoke about Levittown and
Yeah.
all the initial truckers being part of the trucking union, okay, you're speaking about very large numbers of Jewish
Yep.
and Catholic
Yep.
membership.
Yep.
And then somehow you go into this, and by the way, they tend to be very conventional, hardworking people.
Oh.
Okay. And conventional, and we'll say had conventional morality. All of a sudden, I hear you talking about the fact that all of these unions are becoming so liberated.
Yep. Totally.
And not more,
That's right.
not really conventionally moral.
Right.
That doesn't, it just doesn't, it doesn't jive
Right.
with the personalities of the people working in these,
Yeah.
these laborers
Yeah.
working in these unions.
Totally.
I mean, I actually find the working class are far more sexually conventional, even though they're all having affairs, but, you know.
Right, that's-
But it's all over, you know. I find it's the elite, not the working class, who are having a much more unconventional sexual life.
Yeah. Okay, here's the way I think what we're having a conversation of
Related to
yes, is in the room of like, what is the intersection between non-heteronormativity, not being normal, and class power, class oppression. And I think to think about who the people in Levittown were, they were in the middle of upward mobility, right? And so what they had to do was put on an act that, and it was real in a lot of cases, but to be able to perform, we are American middle class people. That means we are married, we have children, we go to synagogue or we go to church, right? We do all the things that make us American. And if you happen on the side to have this or that happen, you don't talk about it. Yes. And so what we know is that elites have always, because they have the privilege and the power, sure, like you can have, you know, I mean, I'll just say for my own, so my family are Irish immigrants, but came in the 1870s, so they, you know, sort of acculturated earlier. Yeah, my great uncles had cities that had athletic clubs in downtowns. That wasn't for working out. It was for where your mistress lived, right? And like, you could do it when you were rich because nobody messed with you, right? And so what I think what we're talking about though is that like, what is the relationship between talking about doing things that are unconventional and doing things that are unconventional? And so if you ask the Teamsters in this book, Sylvia Pagano, do you think you should invest in a sex club where men go and have sex with each other randomly? Sylvia Pagano would have been like, are you kidding me? No. Would she have put the money into the club? Definitely. Right? And so the question is, because you didn't talk about it, but everybody knew what it was, and Vito Genovese went to those places, not to have sex, but because he was proud that he owned them, because he cared that people were entrepreneurs, and he had the hustle to make it, and he made money off of it. And if men were in there doing whatever, well, that's their thing, right? But if you asked Vito Genovese, what are your views on queer people? He would have like swallowed a cigar. He would have been like, bad, terrible, right? And so that is in some ways what we're talking about, is when you have class privilege, you can say you're you don't have to, like it's separate. When you're experiencing class oppression, you have to put on a certain kind of discursive role to say that like, hey, I'm normal. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let me first deal with the gay club issue.
Yeah.
My family owned a restaurant on Sheridan Square.
Yep.
And when my great uncle died, it was called El Chico. The Genovese crime family forced us out of the club because it was common knowledge that all the gay clubs in the village were dominated and run by the mafia, including Stonewall, by the way.
Correct.
So this is no big revelation. It was everyone I grew up in this neighborhood. We all knew this. When my mother was negotiating to take over the restaurant after my great uncle died, the partner there, who was Italian American, said, "Uh-oh, I'm getting out of here because I can see it was involved." So that was what happened, and that was the reality. Now, I was in mobbed-up unions on and off for 20 years. I was in 2 Teamsters union locals, one in 1971, when I was a member of EBAW, and that was a revelation, because all those families were tied up completely with the crime families in New York.
Right.
So, for example, if you were in a shop, and the shop, you talk about queer studies, it would be amusing to bring that up to these guys.
That's what I'm saying.
They would
you
say,
don't bring it up.
total bullshit.
Right.
Because half of them were World War II and Korean War veterans.
Yep.
I mean, it was really intense. And then those of us who had been in Vietnam, you know, we basically smoked and stayed away from these guys. Because it was a weird kind of countercultural thing.
Yeah.
Eddie Murphy's stepfather was there. It was an R&R route for guys in crime crews. There were guys there who would say, I'm putting my kid through college and I'm a hijacker. You know, so the whole idea, and then when I was actually to the point where they're going to let me shop steward, that's when the union leadership came down on my head and they got my ass out of there.
Totally.
Now the second time was in 814 local. That local, 757, 814 was another mobbed up union. And the guy there, they eventually pissed the FBI off because the rigging system to do GSA jobs was so intensely corrupt that the FBI was moved by a mafia-owned union, and they got really pissed off about that when they moved him into the Federal Center. So they eventually went out after leadership. But the guy there, I was caught up in an NLRB case where I signed the card. I wasn't really intending to organize a local, I just wanted to work. And the owner, the union leader came over to the guy who I was working with, the boss, and said, like, pay me $20,000, you're out of here. So, and then later in life, I had to deal with 608, John O'Connor's union. That was when John Gotti tried to kill him.
Yeah.
And so my attitude about the Teamsters union is totally jaundiced.
Yeah.
And, you know, I just find this amusing as all hell, because to me, in New York, they were tied up completely with the 5 families, and that's it. And so, and if you mess with them, they would kill you. They would kill you or do whatever they wanted to you. And you know, I could go into more colorful stories about what happened when I was there. But I'm just curious about that attitude about scholarship, because where are we at in terms of understanding that?
Yeah. Well, one thing just in the room, like, again, we need to have a split between what is said and what happened. If you would have gone in the 50s into any of the small businesses and been like, do you support the rights of some kind of queer people, they would have laughed, reacted violently, right? But what I'm saying is that people invested money in all sorts of different random businesses that then gave people a space to do what they wanted. I'm not making a moral claim about that this model of organizing and making alliances with the underworld that grew out of the 1930s is the way to have a good, strong union. No, that is not what I'm saying. Like, what I'm saying is, in this place and time, this was pivotal to helping marginal workers organize. You have a question.
Yeah, well, it's very similar to the point you just made about whether that makes for a strong union.
Right.
Like when I think about the question asked earlier about why the FBI was investigating, like immediately what comes to mind is like, because that's another form of power outside of the state, and the FBI doesn't want power outside of the state, right? They only want collective organizing. I was in a federal courtroom for 2.5 hours yesterday watching a criminal policy kids get charged with hate crime, like bogus hate crime charges, just because there's like a crackdown on Palestine organizing a movement, for example. But so I'm wondering, with regards to the question about what this means for the future of organizing, I'm curious as to whether you see this like willingness to operate outside of the law, which obviously would be really bad.
I know.
But whether you see that as like a source of labor power that existed then, that doesn't exist now, where often unions are a lot more like a lot more business unions, a lot more like wanting to work within the like very, I don't want to say cooperative like the NLRB, but like that is kind of the constraint of how we can imagine labor power. I have a friend who's salting Teamsters right now, like Amazon labor union. There's no way that guy's gonna get involved with the mafia, right? Like all we're seeing is like recognition, and like the NLRA is like the greatest weapon that we have. And so I'm wondering if you can see in terms of the changing power of U.S. labor, whether it's like the centralization of legality and power and state control as being a part of the story of like the deep.
Yeah, and maybe I could use your answer to your question to address your question, which is about if the top-down because you asked like, is it really a strong union, right? And like your question is, why did the top-down organizing model applied in Jewish and Catholic contexts not keep working as the workforce got more diverse? And I think that, and I would be curious also about your thoughts, like I'm thinking in historical specificity that the top-down model comes out of the 30s when both the ownership of most of these small businesses and the frontline employees were Irish, Italian, and Jewish. What changes dramatically is the giant wave of Puerto Rican migrants in the 50s and the second part of the Great Migration around World War II. So you get a much more marginal, racialized workforce that the top-down organizing model, which sometimes doesn't have explicitly stated political commitments, is like, yeah, we're gonna have this cartel with our jukebox vendor, but then we're also gonna take advantage of what is ultimately a racial cartel, right? And pay Black and Puerto Rican workers less than a minimum wage because we know that the police, the court, the welfare system simultaneously work together to keep people much poorer than in the kind of mono-racial or ethnic context.
So the co-ethnics are different.
Correct. I think that the top-down organizing model, because it was agnostic on values, it worked super well, right? In the early days of the relationship with the mob, before things got less violent in the 70s, but then once the new marginal workers are Black and Puerto Rican, most of these small businesses and their Teamster operatives are like, we're gonna take advantage of marginal workers and pay less than the minimum wage. And it's a really difficult story. Now, the question is like, what do you do about things going forward? And I think what you're implying is exactly what I struggle with most. And here's what I mean. I think, and I say this to my students, I think the thing that I take away from this book, and I didn't really write it explicitly because I'm kind of scared to, and that is, this is a time when marginal workers in the service industry, for all the good and bad, all the negatives of some of the organizing, managers of corporations were afraid of them, right? And that today, like, there just isn't the same fear, right? There's a reason that I read You What I Did, that like, when people threaten people, sometimes change happens. And I don't want to sit here in front of this room and be like, what you need to do is blow up your boss's car. But like, did that help your pay go up? For sure. And I'm gonna let you struggle with the morality because I'm not in religious studies or philosophy, I'm a historian. But I fundamentally believe that, and I'm in a labor struggle at my employer right now, and I think about it every day. I'm like, if we had a strategically placed, because often the Teamsters would not want to kill you in the 50s. It would be like, they even had ballistic experts that were really good at like making the sound of the car blowing up louder than and less like not really that dangerous. Like if a car in the parking lot was like boom, right? Might we get the deal we were looking for? Possibly. And I don't mean to be facetious because there are scary things about it, but I think it's my main takeaway that I don't know what to do. It's the question of how to resist state violence with other violence, and that's very complicated. Yeah.
I actually changed it.
Yeah, go
Changed the topic completely. Because this is called the Teamsters Metropolis,
Yeah.
who killed Jimmy Hoffa?
I'm not going to go into long details, but probably since we've invoked the 5 families, I think the common scholarly consensus now is that Jimmy Hoffa wanted to come back to power in the Teamsters in 1975. And the weak person that Hoffa appointed to run the Teamsters while he was in jail, Frank Fitzsimmons, opened the floodgates to the underworld of Teamster money. And that in New York, the 5 families decided Hoffa's never coming back. Because at his core, Hoffa cared about organizing workers. And that Fitz was the key to keeping the juice flowing to Anthony Provenzano and all those things. And I think so I think the consensus is that Provenzano ordered the hit, and that I don't know who did the hit, but I read the part with Anthony Giacalone because he, of course, and Chuck O'Brien, Sylvia Pagano's son, were the last 2 people seen of Jimmy Hoffa when he was in money. Did they do it? Definitely not. I don't think that they knew that was coming, but they do all fit together. Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for the talk and for the book. And I have 2 comments on method. I'm an anthropologist, I'm a historian, but I like to read labor history, and I think that so much labor history is narrated as a story about power. And this was really sort of revelatory and interesting to me because, yes, it's a story about power, but you really narrate it as a story about desires.
Yeah.
Like ones that are normal, like have a place to live, and ones that are sort of hedonistic, like Miami Beach, my type vacation, you know. And I found that really, really, really fascinating, and it had an interesting sort of square with some of the labor organizing that I've been privy to, participated in, whatever, a few campaigns, whatever. A thing I would hear is organizing gets the goods.
Yeah.
And here, I was like, oh, these are the goods.
Yeah.
It's the car. It's all these things.
Yeah.
And I was sort of wondering about the history of that comment that I have heard so frequently. You've heard it too. So that's one thing I wanted to thank you for that. And the other one was a methodological question with the wiretap, which is, have you worked with wiretap footage recording before? And if so, was this the same or different? And also, what is it like to work with that kind of data? You know, like, I think a lot of anthropologists are like, oh, well, what if I was a fly on the wall and I could just see what happens in here?
Yeah.
This is a really interesting version of that, despite Pagano's vacuum cleaning and all the ways to sort of cover sound. Like, she seemed to maybe know, right?
Yes.
But,
yeah,
I'm so curious about, like, what that is like.
Yeah, okay, so a couple of things about using the wiretap. First, I made an ethical call. I decided I wouldn't publish anything about Sylvia Pagano or Jimmy Hoffa or Josephine Hoffa's sex life that hadn't already been published. There are other things, and I just decided not to, because I didn't want to make this a kind of pornographic or like expose but instead I wanted to use it as a basis for critique. So I made decisions not to tell some parts of the story that I could have told, just because I wanted to be respectful of a privacy that had already been totally violated. Now, in terms of the value of the wiretap, it amazes me that the FBI caught anyone in the middle of the 20th century. Here's a couple of examples. So, what do you think the language that Sylvia Pagano and Anthony Giacalone most often spoke to each other in?
Italian.
Yes, Sicilian.
Right.
The transcript, so the original FBI sound files are gone. They don't exist. So I'm dealing with the transcript.
Okay.
They didn't transcribe the Sicilian. Yep.
Oh.
Okay, because they said that they were speaking a foreign language.
Wow.
Like, it's like, it was like baffling. And now I'm going to say something that is painful, I think. So, black people don't get last names in FBI transcriptions from that time. Ruby and Marie were both black. And the vacuum was on literally all the time. Frequently the vacuum was on when Anthony Giacalone came over, right? There is no, who does that? Right? Like nobody is like, I'm having my date over. Like I want 2 domestic workers here, both vacuuming. Right? And there's a way, I could never prove this because I couldn't figure out who Ruby and Marie were. Right? How many people were named Ruby in Detroit in the 50s? I have no idea. But like, I don't believe. Also, Sam, the maintenance man, no last name. He always carried the bag of money from the garage to Pagano's apartment. Who is Sam? Why does he have the money? The FBI didn't care, right? So it's just, so what you're getting in the transcription, and that's a lot in the chapter, so like, they translate racial slurs, but will not translate the F word. So Sylvia would swear, because they don't like it when women swear. So there would be like F ... but then she'd never used racial slurs, but her male interlocutors often did, and those were translated as if they were neutral descriptions, right? So like, so what you're dealing with is just, it's bad. I'm like, how did you catch anyone? Like, were Pagano and Giacalone purposely speaking Sicilian to each other? No, it was their first language. Like, and so, it's like most of the transcript is when Josephine Hoffa came over, or when Jimmy Hoffa was there, because Hoffa was, from a, old stock family, and Josephine Hoffa was Polish. Neither of them spoke Sicilian. So, like, that's why the transcript is there. So, anyways, that's, yeah. Should I address any of your questions? Or to any, yeah. What do you want me to address?
How are we doing?
Yeah, how are we doing it?
There's still 10 minutes left.
Sorry, 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
I forget, what was the first question you asked?
About the over. So one question that
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
even more now than before we had this conversation. Are we talking when you the implication about the stuff about queer domestic?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Is that
This is a good question.
is that
Yeah.
to include rank and file Teamsters like this woman raised who seem more conventional in their lifestyles maybe, or at least on the surface, maybe not in real life, but at least the way they talk about it and all that? Or are we talking just about the sort of activists and leaders?
No.
You're talking about everybody.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and because I'm trying to think about queerness really broadly. Like I think, and you implied this in the first question, it's like, what is queer about Sylvia Pagano? Like, is there lesbian desire? No, I didn't find any. I mean, amazing if there was, but like, couldn't find it.
Okay.
So don't want to foreclose that, but we'll like leave it out there as a possibility. But like, I think the queerest thing about Sylvia Pagano is that she was single, right? And she had like 5 boyfriends. Josephine Hoffa, or
I
Jimmy.
know lots of women like that. I mean, both in the past and the present.
Right, but in the 50s, I think that's what we're saying.
Because
like,
she didn't, like you said, she had so much money, she didn't need a breadwinner in her.
Right.
Like, she was independent and she lived life the way she wanted to. But is that queer?
Well, I just think, could a woman in the 50s have been like, oh, I have 5 boyfriends? right? That's not a thing, right? That is an incredibly stigmatized.
Well, you
set of
wouldn't
facts.
talk about it like you said, but there were others who did it.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's what I think I'm trying to point out, is that like
Yeah.
people have lived their lives in very complex ways. Jimmy Hoffa's daughter testified, it's amazing, she testified under oath that Sylvia Pagano was married 7 times, most of them were simultaneous. Now, that is not true, right? That is not at all true. Also, she and other people testified that Sylvia Pagano, an infant died, and that Sylvia Pagano was really an undocumented immigrant, not related to her own family, and that used the baby's birth certificate to like become a new person with citizenship. None of this is true, right? But like the point is, I think she lived in a way that was far beyond the norm, and I think more people than we think did. I think that microphone, I put that quote in there because of the way they brought into speech, and I think your question involves speech, like what do you think about the rights of group X? For a moment there, they brought into speech something very unconventional, where Sylvia is like, we've been together for 5 years. And he's like, yeah, that's cool. And like, that isn't a thing you say, right? Like, Zena Giacalone was like a really important figure in her community. So were his 4 children. Like, you don't talk about that. And so what I'm thinking about, and again, like, don't read this as more like, wow, that's so courageous. I'm just saying that, like, I think people live their lives in complicated ways that because of what they have to perform as normal, gets to be the dominant story about sexuality, which is then why we think, why is it that college professors have such amazing politics about the lesbians and the gays and the trans people, but like ordinary people have such awful politics? And part of me is like, I don't know that that's right. It's just like a difference in the use of language and who has to perform what to be able to operate in spaces of power. Yeah. Did I do it?
Well, no, that's really interesting. Well, so the other thing that I've often observed is that there's 2 unions in the period of union decline that keep organizing. One of them is the Teamsters, and the other is FCIU. They're both former AFL unions, and they both use a lot of the approaches that you describe in the book. There's very little written about either of them in that earlier period. I mean, like it's weird.
It's really weird.
But so is this just like organizing outside the Wagner Act in the period where the Wagner Act is being pulled apart, or is this something else? I mean, that's one question. And then, I don't know if you can address this, but is it true that queer people are overrepresented among union activists? And if so, why?
Yeah, we actually, in the editorial process, had a debate about this book about whether it should be about countercultural unionism in the middle of the 20th century rather than about the Teamsters. I decided I want to kind of focus on, because of the way that the Teamsters became a discursive object. It's like, oh my god, that's the crazy guys with the gold, whatever, right? And so I was like, I want to like work through that cultural stereotype, but I actually think it is a broader facet of like the really unknown AFL unions. The upholsterers union was full of drama, both underworld, unruly unionism, the leather, blah blah blah, like very much old school. Yeah. And so all of these groups use these unconventional organizing methods, and so I think there is something wrong. I think that there was a kind of counterculture that was outside the liberal part of the movement that came from the CIO, right? That again, the part that we were talking about is the less ideological part, more 100 flowers. Like there's just everything is happening in all different directions. There is no Walter Reuther operation telling you what the politics should be. The politics are whatever you want them to be.
That's the decentralization.
It's the decentralization. And then in terms of queer people and organizing, I mean, I'm just thinking way back, like classic, like Annalisa Orloff's work, right? About like what is union organizing at its core? You're never home. You are on the road. You are like living in a hotel. Your best friend from the union is amazing, right? And like, why is it that she's so much cooler than all the guys that I'm dating, right? And that, right, or that, like that's, and I think, that's Orloff's point, that like you just sort of, you're always on the road, you're never home, and all of a sudden you start to like just imagine a world otherwise. and I think that so I think that is true. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm queer and a former SCIU organizer, and all my colleagues, all the other like entry-level organizers at SCIU were also queer.
Uh-huh.
This was during the pandemic, so we were all working from home.
Yeah.
So there was no, glamour, traveling abroad. I was calling people in like Maryland and in Florida.
I'm so
all the-
sorry.
No, but actually, I think that there's maybe there's a psychological element or something about the role of queerness that people want in organizing, or that attracts queer people to organizing, in part because it's like all you do is listen to stories and ask questions about people, and it's like having people almost tell it's like okay, this is a really half-baked analogy, but it's like encouraging people to come out with their story, maybe like walking people through that process.
Yeah.
But it's their story as it relates to their experience as a worker. And so, I don't know, maybe they're like, it doesn't really fit in with what we've been talking about today in terms of like all these crime families and these unions kind of like saying, well, as long as they're successful, like we don't care that they're queer. But it might, it sort of could be like a similar discursive standpoint, maybe.
I think there's something there. Okay, I'll just really quickly comment, but like I had so Earlham where I teach, like we tried to hire and align in trans studies, and that didn't happen. And so like some students were talking about like what did they really get out of their education in women's gender and sexuality studies, and this amazing student is like, I'm trans, and I found out that it's just unions. That's like all it really is. Which is because I was the chair. And like, but I thought that was like, and the student was in some ways messing with me. It was like literally a written like evaluation of our program. But like it also I think was meant partially to be supportive because of exactly what you're talking about. There's just something, about archiving, telling stories, recovering repressed speech, something. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I would just add another theory to the bucket.
Yeah.
I'm an organizer with the graduate student union at NYU here, and I've found that so much of organizing is rejecting what your employer or the person in a position of power tells you to take for granted. And so I feel like the cases that were hardest to win, that we did win in like negotiations at NYU with student contract meetings or whatever, is when they tell you, well, because obviously you weren't meant to do this, and you're like, wait, but why not? And then they say, and then you're like, wait, but why not? And then you just keep pushing until eventually they're like, I guess you're right. And I feel like there's something about counterculture as well that's like a rejection of what you're meant to take for granted, right? Like someone tells you something that's status quo and you poke at it a little bit further until it starts falling apart.
Totally, and union organizing is always kind of about something else. Right, like what it is always like, I'm upset and I'm not telling you why I'm really upset, but like, yes, I want a raise. And like, it allows you the space to then vent the other thing that's inside you, whatever that is. And so I think that is that is a way to think about it. How are we doing our time?
We're just about out of time.
Can I just end with a couple of anecdotes? So one is, long ago in the 1980s, I was invited to give some talk for International Women's Day or something on Long Island to a bunch of librarians who were trying to organize, and they were self-organizing, but they were shopping around for the right union. And the union they chose was the Teamsters. Why? Well, it's the same thing that somebody said before about they thought that would give them power. Like these were women librarians. Maybe they were queer, I don't know, but they were. It was the attraction to muscle. Is what they want. They wanted to win, and they thought that was. So that's one story. And the other thing that's going through my head is thinking about today's labor leaders, many of whom are semi out of the closet queer people, like Stuart Applebaum. I'm sorry if I'm surprising anybody. Randy Weingarten, Mary Kay Henry. I mean, they're definitely overrepresented at that level. Whether that's true in the rank of, I have no idea. And then the Starbucks thing is the other obvious one. So what is that? Like, what drives that? I mean, I still really don't understand it. It's clearly true, but why?
Yeah, it's like a speculative. We need to all as a group co-author a speculative book about why this is true. Are we?
What? If there's another hand up, I won't stop.
Yeah, go ahead.
There is one.
Yeah.
It was interesting to listen to you two talk about organizing because I think how different it was in the 1970s, forget about it. But talking, because I had all in the family to work with as a jump-off point when I would come into work every day. And so
Correct.
but it gets to me that my problem with the academy has been the non-college educated white worker.
Yeah.
Forget about it. They haven't really grappled with that problem for 50 years. And now we're left with the situation we're in right now as Americans. That cohort is so xenophobic, so racist, that it's like, how do you penetrate that? And it's interesting to hear this issue of gay people being labor leaders. That sure as hell wasn't the case when I was younger.
Yeah.
But how do you, I'm just wondering, how do you confront that issue as an issue that we have to practically deal with right now as Americans? To weaken that part of his coalition, and the issue of false consciousness comes in all the time.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of me is like, we teach the story of the labor movement that's mostly about white workers, right? And like, so I'm not like. I
Yeah, but
understand-
come on, man. I have to push back on that. I mean, again, my
Yeah.
experience in the teacher union was
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
very confident of their
Totally.
power.
Right.
They felt that they could disrupt the whole country in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And that was it, period.
I
They
think
loved
one of
that.
the ways that I'm just like, as you're
Yeah.
talking, I think that what we're talking about here is a shift in intellectual paradigms, right? And that like coming out of the 30s, the reason if you were in a university setting in 1955, like what you would be struggling with is like what should be the nature of the way capitalism works. It's the old laissez-faire way or this new way that this sort of CIO brought in. Those are, welfare state model. And then in the 1960s, there's a complete revolution in thought globally, which is what it maybe the differences between us, right, are what actually structure the way the economy works. And like, I think you have to be generous that people need a little bit of time to work through that, right? We worked through the capitalism question for 200 years. Like, we're in year 50 of that other question. I don't know exactly where we are. I understand it might have a complicated sort of trail behind it right now. But this book, in some ways, I think I'm trying to do what you're asking, which is like, this is a movement that both who we would now call like working class white people and brown and black working class people had different complicated experiences together. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write it. So here we are.
Thank you so much.